Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast in which we imagine things, including each other and this podcast.
True that. Truthfulness is that is true. True is what that is. Yes.
And here with me, and my name is Ken, is my fellow podcaster, Tony. Say hi.
Hi.
You're going to make this as awkward as possible, aren't you?
If at all possible, yes. Yes.
Okay. So we're here today to talk about an entirely non-dramatic, non-awkward subject.
Yep.
Which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to open the podcast with what was originally the epigram to Frankenstein, and which was eventually removed from subsequent editions. Mary Shelley actually re-released Frankenstein about 20 years after the original publication, and the epigram was removed in that version. But I find it haunting in the best possible way. So we are going to haunt our podcast today with
Excellent.
the lines from Paradise Lost by Milton. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So, Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
We have heard a lot
We have.
about Frankenstein.
Yep.
Over the years, and we've especially been hearing a lot about it lately.
Mm-hmm.
Those of you who follow our reviews online might have noticed that we've been reviewing some texts on Goodreads and various other places that are inspired by
Like our website.
this story. Like our website,
Uh-huh.
which you should visit
Yep.
totally at www.imaginaries.net. Not plugging us at all, but Frankenstein seems to be of a special importance right now, or a timely importance. And I wanted to discuss both Mary Shelley and the legacy of Frankenstein separately and together.
Mm-hmm.
And how these stories, the story of Mary Shelley and the story of Frankenstein, have informed modern science fiction and the science fiction that we know and love, which may or may not be the same thing. And I'm curious to unpack that a little bit with you today, Tony.
Yes,
So,
yes.
First of all, we've talked about the monstrous on a previous podcast. What makes this podcast and Frankenstein different from that?
Well, you ask an interesting question. It's true.
Oh, wait, thank you.
There isn't a difference. I mean, I'm just gonna, say it straight. I don't think there's a big difference in talking about monsters generally versus Frankenstein specifically. We had a podcast devoted to spiders. We had a podcast devoted to aliens and the alien. We're not... My feeling about this is that we're not tackling topics which are distinct enough that we're like, okay, here's where spiders stop and where monsters begin. Of course there's overlap. These borders are messy. Yeah, Frankenstein is a monster. Monsters include Frankenstein, and yet talking about Mary Shelley's legacy and the legacy of Frankenstein is worth talking about separate from other monsters, I think. So that's my hot take on it. I don't know how you feel about what makes this different enough to talk about.
Well, I think we'll probably get into it a little bit. There are perhaps some distinctions which render Frankensteinian sci-fi as unique from straight-up monster horror sci-fi. But yeah, I agree that our best podcasts usually are when things are pretty messy and we're struggling for definition.
Yep.
So I'm not necessarily too interested in drawing hard and fast lines, but I think it's worth noting that we are looking to see if there are distinctions, and that tension is what informs our best episodes, and we're just gonna go at it today a little bit. So a little background on Mary Shelley. Should I go ahead and give us a bio?
Absolutely, please do. Okay, so before you do, the only anecdote I remember is that there's something about, fucking Percy Bysshe Shelley on a gravestone or something.
Yeah.
I don't know that's a thing. I don't know where that came from.
So, Mary Shelley is, of course, famous independently of her husband.
Right, yes.
But there's also this whole issue about her legacy being framed and controlled by her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, or however you pronounce it. So to kind of run down some of the basic facts about Mary Shelley. She was born Mary Wollstonecraft. I believe she was, she might have been Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. See, here's the issue with Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. She is the daughter of another Mary Wollstonecraft. Mm-hmm. And her mother is world-renowned, and I studied in high school for being the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Mm-hmm. Which is a seminal feminist text, basically, which sets out to prove that women are not inferior to men. They just haven't received the education that men have. Mm-hmm. And if men and women were to receive the same level of education, women would be proven, if not equals, superiors to men. Mm-hmm. And Mary Shelley was born into this unusual family in that her mother had had several dalliances with various men before settling down with Godwin, and it's assumed that Godwin didn't necessarily mind that he was marrying someone for the time who had this unusual backstory, romantically speaking. Mm-hmm. And then Mary Wollstonecraft dies, I believe, less than a month after Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was born. And so she was raised by her father, who was a little bit more traditional, but who had a couple of children, stepchildren, or they were half siblings or something along those lines. And they ended up all receiving unusual educations. They were all highly educated women who ended up traveling the world with Percy Bysshe Shelley and the Lord Byron, the poet. And they went on their various rambunctious rampages around Europe. They all got pregnant at various points in time and had various dalliances of their own. And then they settled down and started writing. And while the other two did not become famous authors, they were all highly literate and highly productive writers. And Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley ended up publishing Frankenstein before she turned 20 and becoming the most famous of all. Now, Frankenstein had a preface by Percy Bysshe Shelley. It probably would not have been published without his interference and the interference of other family connections. And ever since the publication of Frankenstein, therefore, the legacy of science fiction, the legacy of the monstrous, has been tied up with this notion that men control women's stories, or men are necessary in order to allow women's stories to be heard. So when we talk about the gravestone situation, we're not really talking about an actual literal gravestone of Mary Shelley's, which has something of Percy Bysshe Shelley's on it. But she was inspired by a gravestone. And a lot of myths have come up around Mary Shelley related to gravestones and the control of her voice by her husband. And that isn't necessarily really what happened in a lot of ways. Like, there's a lot of myths that are actually not true. And then there are some myths that have partial seeds of truth. And then there are some myths which are actually literally true. But I think that's really fitting for the fact that, Frankenstein is essentially a capital R romantic work. And Tony, mm-hmm. I've just been word vomiting on you. Are you familiar with the Romantics?
No. No.
For those of you guys who are interested in studying the history of the novel and the development of the Romantics as a movement within literature, I highly recommend you dig into some of the biographies of Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron, because they all had a profound influence on what came after. Collectively, they were all in relationships with each other. Sometimes those were sexual, sometimes those were just deeply intellectual relationships, but there was something incredibly powerful about the role of feeling in capital R romantic works, which sees some evidence in Frankenstein, but is even more dramatically drawn out in other works around the same time by contemporaries and friends of Mary Shelley. And that is essentially the long and the short of Mary Shelley's background. She was a very young, very inexperienced kid when she originally married Percy. Slightly less inexperienced than the average kid of her age, but still, relatively inexperienced. Over the course of her relationship with Percy Bysshe Shelley, she gained some knowledge of the world, and generally speaking, her work in Frankenstein comes from the earlier part of her life, when she was less experienced, but was on the cusp of discovery and starting to tackle some of these really, life issues. So, that's the bio.
What I was, the thing that I was like half remembering, I looked it up, and apparently, I don't know how verifiable this is, but this is what I was trying to remember. She ended up having sex with Percy Shelley when she was 17 on her mother's gravestone.
Oh. You never know. They were very dramatic back then.
Right? I'm like, that is the most, it's the most melodramatic possible thing. So, props to Mary Shelley.
It feels totally like an episode from Penny Dreadful. It's definitely like an episode of Penny Dreadful. However, I will say it's definitely verifiable that Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley were entangled by the time she was 17, as she was pregnant by the time she was 17.
Yes, totally. Okay, so let us talk about the legacy of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein.
Let's do it.
So,
yes. So, Tony.
Yes.
What does it mean on a large scale for science fiction to trace its origins back to a woman, albeit a white woman, from a privileged class in Europe?
Can we just reflect on the fact that a lot of, and by no means all, of the folks who study science fiction history, science fiction criticism, etc., trace science fiction as a genre back to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein as the first work to really consider some of the tropes that they consider, especially science fictional, that helps offset science fiction as a different field of writing. We've talked a lot about the Seven Beauties of Science Fiction, which is a newer work. There's been science fiction criticism, science fiction study for a while. And like I said, not everyone agrees, but I personally take Mary Shelley to be the first science fiction author. And we had this question, and I mean, part of the question you asked is something that we were both thinking about in our show notes. What does it mean to claim Mary Shelley as an influence? What does it mean to trace writing lineage back to her? Which is a really interesting question, I think, in two different ways. First way, if you're an author today who, for example, says your influences include Mary Shelley, or if you're a reader and you're reading a new book of science fiction and you're like, this seems very close to Frankenstein or very close to Mary Shelley's writing style. First of all, that's probably not going to happen all that much unless someone's intentionally imitating it. But that's sort of an interesting thing to deal with, and say, what is it about Mary Shelley in particular? What is it about Frankenstein as, the original science fiction text that readers would be drawn to as a comparison? Second thing that I was thinking of, the fact that it all funnels back to Mary Shelley, that every science fiction author can kind of, trace their lineage back to her, is really interesting. And that is wholly different than, say, and obviously these folks would have come a lot later, but, if someone was to claim that Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke or Robert Heinlein was, the original science fiction author, and all science fiction afterwards could be traced back to him. But the fact that we can go back, much further than that, and really say, okay, here's the origin point, and it is Mary Shelley. The fact that she was a woman, a young woman, who wrote the first science fictional text. there's just something about that is like intensely satisfying for our project of the podcast when we're trying to queer so much of what goes on in science fiction and fantasy. I just really like that a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Can you put your finger on why specifically it's satisfying for it to be a young woman when it might be less satisfying if it was a young man or an old man?
I think it's satisfying because there is this there's a word I'm trying to think of and it's not coming to me, but like this, you know, I can sort of, I appreciate that you gave the context because I did not know a lot of that, or I knew it and forgot it or something. I don't know. It wasn't in my head anyway. But to have the context and still to, you know, really knowing the context just enhances the story. But I think what makes it so satisfying for me is the fact that this genre that was dominated by men for so long, that came out of this intense speculation that was also dominated by men. On the one side, you had science, the base for science fiction, which for so long was the sole province of white, straight, upper middle class men. On the other side, you had fantasy, which, you know, represented by works like Lord of the Rings, was really coming out of this very academic project of history where folks like J.R.R. Tolkien were getting, you know, old European histories, which again were being bent into the shape that was very white, very straight, very male dominated. And so both of those coming up together gives you this history that sort of precludes that those genres originally were, I don't want to say founded by, because it wasn't like, it didn't, I don't know that there was any intention to make a new genre.
It wasn't a thing.
Right.
Yeah, it wasn't a thing with a capital T at the time.
Right. But, and yet the fact that we can sort of, you know, trace those tropes, trace those legacies back to Mary Shelley, is kind of like a looking over your shoulder and querying what happened in history. Again, not that this was necessarily like a thing that history didn't tell us, or at least modern history didn't record, like Mary Shelley's place was still there, but the fact that you can kind of like take her as a historical figure, especially as a literary historical figure, queer that history a little bit and say, no, she was the founder of science fiction. That I find very satisfying.
So, which leads very nicely into my next question, which is, how does the tracing of things back to Mary Shelley, or the resonances with Mary Shelley that we see in the works of authors we know and love today, like authors who are currently writing, how does that inform the work? What is important about that? Is it because it inherently queers things to refer back to Mary Shelley? What is the magic that tying things back to her now in obvious ways create?
Well, let's do a thought experiment. Okay. So, the other work that I have seen referred to a lot as kind of like the original science fiction fantasy text is Gulliver's Travels.
Okay.
And just
Yes.
Within this thought experiment, if we were to sort of say, okay, we can trace the genres that we talk about so often back to Mary Shelley or back to Jonathan Swift, like, how do we approach those differently?
Well, you have the advantage of me, for the first class I ever taught at the college level was on Restoration and 18th century literature, and my first lecture ever was on Jonathan Swift. Wow. And historically, the role he played in the happenings in Ireland during the Troubles. It's so interesting because depending on who you tie it back to, the historical resonances are different. Are we talking about a white man from an underprivileged class or a white woman from a privileged class? Now, there are things about Mary Shelley that set her apart from the usual privileged class white woman at the time. But generally speaking, you're talking about two very different social roles, two very different life experiences that informed the surreal elements in their works. Although I don't know if you would say Mary Shelley was surreal. I personally would, but I'd be curious to hear what you say about that. So, Jonathan Swift, Lilliputians, I mean, we can see resonances with him in, say, Philip Pullman's Book of Dust. And that strikes a very different note than if Philip Pullman had gone Dr. Frankenstein in Book of Dust. Oh, maybe he's saving that for the sequel. Who knows? Anyway, yeah, so continue your thought experiment. Draw it to its conclusion.
So, I'm glad that you brought up the point about class, because that is really interesting, and it's hard to sort of trace history back to figures like Jonathan Swift and Mary Shelley and not hold them up as sort of like lower class author, woman author. Like, it's just difficult to avoid essentializing them, reducing them to one particular quality that they represent. And so, I'm glad you brought that up, because it really, takes it from a really imbalanced, like, woman versus man to, like, lower class man versus upper class woman, which I don't mean to say versus exactly, but just, it's never, there are different ways to sort of look at these lines of inequity. And I'm going to get way in over my head if I try and contextualize them, because you know way more than I do about that. No, you do. Trust me. So the thought experiment. Sorry. Going back to the thought experiment. No. Do we trace science fiction back to Mary Shelley? Do we trace it back to Jonathan Swift? And fantasy. Sorry, I should have thrown fantasy in there. And the reason I point this out is that we could, again, thinking of gender, thinking of class, we could trace it back in terms of like, oh, well, science fiction has an upper class history of, relatively well-off people, whether they were, in the British aristocracy or whether they were like the new class of engineers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s of the U.S. Like, there's that history. Or we could look at it and say, oh, well, if we trace back to Swift, there's like this history of men writing science fiction and fantasy. When in reality, this is all so much more complicated than it seems.
It really is,
But the reason why I think this is a useful thought experiment is that it gives us different sort of inflection points on the way. Like, if we trace it back to Mary Shelley, then we magnify people like, who are some of the folks you wrote down? James Tiptree Jr., Joanna Russ, more recently, kind of more recently, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, Nnedi Okorafor. Like, we can sort of pick out this constellation of women writers who are and have done really, really important work, and yet, because of any number of lines of inequity, social inequity, that from societies that still are less likely to see women as equal to men in many ways, in many fields, in many contexts, that history strikes me as more important, because even though Jonathan Swift may have been, lower class, he was still a dude. And so tracing it back to a dude, tracing the class divisions in science fiction's history doesn't quite have the same clout, I don't think. I don't know. I'm sort of like rambling now, but I'm trying to like piece together why I think it's important that Mary Shelley is the one who I think of at least as, the founder of science fiction.
Well, and in Jonathan Swift's defense, that is not the right word. I think to further your work of complicating the story of Mary Shelley, I would also complicate the story of Jonathan Swift, in that I think he too is the product of his times, and he's more than just a one-class dude. In fact, that's a large part of his story, and the reason why you can teach entire classes on Jonathan Swift is because he did interact with multiple classes. He did, in a sense, transcend multiple classes. He did mix and match. He did fight for various classes. He did actively fight various classes. He was a dude who was complicated. Mary Shelley was a lass who was complicated. And I think one of the most interesting things to kind of look at is, are there other Mary Wollstonecraft Shelleys out there? Like you talked about James Tiptree Jr., Nnedi Okorafor, Octavia Butler. Like, when we look at the history of science fiction, how many times did the genre take a complete right turn because of one unique figure. And science fiction had its roots before Mary Shelley, but it definitely took a strong right turn when she showed up on the scene. I mean, she was the inheritor of the flame of the romantic. She was also the inheritor of the flame of the gothic novel. She was kind of like a second generation novelist. It's hard to believe that once upon a time there were no novels, but she really lived to see the birth of the novel as a thing. And she was one of the early adopters, not the earliest generation to adopt novels, but one of the early adopters. And so, like, she's way back in not just the history of science fiction, but the history of the novel. The story in novel form, which I think is really, really fascinating. And genre and novels have taken some left and right turns since then. And I think some of the most pleasurable turns have come from specific authors and some have come from situations. But what do you think? I mean, are there other Mary Shelleys out there, other right turns that the genre has taken that are as dramatic and poignant and satisfying?
Yes.
As the one it took with her?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, okay. That's a big question. Like, it's a big question. It's a hard question because, I mean, like I've been saying for the past 20 minutes or whatever, like, I think science fiction kind of started with Mary Shelley as far as, like, we can trace the genre back to a starting point. Like, this was science fiction, before that it wasn't. So you're talking about something that's, you know, utterly game-changing. But I think that there are some examples of, you know, even if they're not necessarily single works or single authors, like, trends that really shifted the way that the genre functions. I think the feminist science fiction writers who really started to be influential in, I want to say the 60s, but definitely the 70s. I would have to look at some dates again. I would say the authors who started to incorporate ecology and changing climate into their works. You used the term cli-fi a few podcasts ago, so the beginnings of cli-fi for sure. The penetration of weird into science fiction and that messy crossover. Obviously, since we're talking about it, the first works that really said that science fiction had to take queering the genre and LGBTQ plus folks seriously, you know, and I would use the example of Nicola Griffith, who has been writing feminist science fiction and queer positive science fiction since the early 90s. She's as far back as I would go. I would have to look and see if there are other earlier ones. But I think all of those are really important examples of when the genre took, like you said, a hard left. Like, this changed things up, not forever, but it added, you know, things that hadn't been there before. And kind of looking back on them, you know, what kind of makes me think that this is that kind of change is trying and maybe failing to be able to conceptualize what it was like before. You know, what was it like to be in a science fiction world where you know, there were only men, where women didn't play a role? What was it like to be in a science fictional world where all the books focused on, you know, nothing to do with the life sciences or ecology, nothing talked about climate or climate change? And in part, you know, it isn't really a thought experiment this way because we still have all those books. We can go back and look at them. But it's sort of, you know, reading with that intent is like, oh, well, this book hasn't aged so well for XYZ reasons. And I'm using the examples I think that are closest to me, but we could easily go back and say things like, you know, robots and androids in science fiction were new at some point. The space opera was new at some point. Like, everything had a beginning. So certainly, everything that I think of as important to science fiction today had to have had a Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley moment, for sure.
Which provides an interesting transition, I think, to the question of hearkening back.
Yes.
So we now can't imagine a world without Mary Shelley in science fiction. We can't imagine various other innovations to the form. Why, right now, are people so obsessed with Mary Shelley? And why are so many of the authors writing Frankensteinian works men?
So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of those works. You mentioned a couple in our show notes. A couple, in fact, that have come out either originally or in English recently, like within the past year. You mentioned John Kessel's Pride and Prometheus. You mentioned Ahmed Sadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad. There are others.
There are loads of comics like those by Rick Remender and Jeff Lemire. And I know that you mentioned Young Frankenstein, the film.
I did,
yeah,
which obviously is going back, many, many decades before this. But there have been other film adaptations, film reboots of the Frankenstein story, of the Frankenstein myth over the years. Like, whether or not they've been treated is another question. But obviously, Young Frankenstein is a classic and a new take on an older story. But your question still stands for sure, because all those works that we've mentioned have been by male authors, male creators. So why men? Why does Frankenstein feel like something that men are so interested in?
Like, you might as well ask, why not men?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to say, this is a genre which has appealed to all genders, as long as you can remember, that's great. Men are great. Let's bring them in on the Frankensteinian parade. But when a list is entirely composed of men, and when it's referring to a source material that was created by a woman, I start to wonder, like, what's going on here? Where are the women?
Yeah.
And there is a Goodreads list that we will link when we post this episode live from our website. Someone else has done the hard work of compiling, like, all of the works inspired by Frankenstein, in the last 20 years or something. And some of them are written by women. Most of them are young adult and or deal with vampires. So there's some crossover work that has been done by women. But generally speaking, like the more strictly adhering to the legacy of Frankenstein works, like John Kessel's Pride and Prometheus and Ahmed Sadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, like, they are written by men. If it has Frankenstein in the title, usually it's written by a man, which kind of kills me a little bit. So what do you think's going on there? You're male.
Yeah, okay. So here is my armchair diagnosis.
Okay.
So, also in our show notes, which we will get to in a few minutes, is a discussion of some of the content legacies of Frankenstein. Like, what is it about the Frankenstein story that have carried into modern science fiction that keep coming up as plot points? And one of the things that I wrote down is that it's very much that, scientific creation and things get complicated. But ultimately, it's the story of the creator and creating something by the power of science that didn't exist before. And that sort of, distilled story of making something, to quote John Hammond from Jurassic Park, via the sheer power of will, is something that, I don't know, I just feel that's like very much like a hard-on for a lot of men. Making the thing, being the creator, being the founder, being, the top, the pinnacle, the one who can look and say, I am your father, I am your maker, I am your God. Like, that is just a fantasy. A male, like, certainly not a solely male fantasy, but a typically male fantasy, maybe.
Well, and it may be that there have been as many women as men inspired to write works inspired by Frankenstein, but that, proportionally speaking, more written by men have risen to prominence and or been published, which is a different conversation altogether, which we might get into someday, disparities in publishing. But I think let's circle back a moment, because you said something which piqued my interest, in that you drew a direct line between Frankenstein and Jurassic Park.
Ah, yes.
And leaving aside the gender thing, because gender, I mean, there's no sorting that out for me right now. If we put gender aside, if it can be put aside, if that's a thing that we can do, like, what does Frankenstein offer writers and readers that's timeless and timely? And you went straight for Frankenstein and Jurassic Park.
I did.
Why? Why?
Because well, if I can expand from the distillate story a little bit, Frankenstein is essentially the story of scientific creation that exceeds the boundaries of its creator's intent. And that, to me, is exactly what Jurassic Park is about. It is kind of Frankenstein retold through an 80s and 90s understanding of chaos theory, of, how how we didn't know back then that DNA had a shorter half-life than we thought, and so you couldn't actually take it out of mosquitoes. But, it's very interested in the science of the day, what it can be used to create, and then how that creation goes wrong.
And how that can entertain the masses.
Right. How the story of scientific creation and scientific creation gone awry, more specifically, is really entertaining and can be used to sort of load a parable about whatever the author wants to warn about in the back of that thing. And in Mary Shelley's case, I think it's aged in such a way that the parable is both very obvious and yet very subtle. In Michael Crichton and Steven Spielberg's case, the parable is maybe a little less subtle. But maybe, I don't know, maybe in 150 years when kids are reading Jurassic Park and trying to analyze what the hell was going on in chaos theory in the late 80s, that'll be a thing. But I also, I mentioned Jurassic Park because I think that parallels Frankenstein's plot very closely. But I think that there are examples of scientific creations that exceed the boundaries of their creator's intent across science fiction in all forms. And I hooked in Data from Star Trek The Next Generation as a positive example of that, as a being in science fiction who is scientifically created, who exceeds the bounds of known science, first of all. In the Star Trek universe, Data is almost unique in that the computer that runs him isn't something that anyone else can really duplicate. But Data's goal is pretty much to exceed the sum of his programming in a quest to, basically become a better person, become more human. So that's, again, very much a Frankenstein story in that Data was kind of cobbled together by a creator. In fact, Data's brother is kind of the much more traditional, and then turns on his creator. But I think it's harder to come up with those positive examples, and yet it's interesting that they are very much air quotes, Frankenstein stories, just, told in a little bit of a different way.
I find that fascinating, too, because if you're looking for super obvious parables, I'd go for something like The Human Centipede.
Yeah.
Or The Borg, or zombies, where things are cobbled together and made horrific by the act of cobbling together.
Yeah.
And I think that it's more interesting, perhaps, to draw these parallels to something like Jurassic Park, which is thematically ambitious, and The Next Generation, which likewise was thematically ambitious and not just relying on, the body horror trope, which I do think that there's elements of body horror to Frankenstein. I mean, it's pretty clear in the dry rhetoric of the day, which I would also note was not considered dry for its day. It was considered pretty colorful and racy.
Yeah.
But in what we would consider the dry rhetoric of the day, Frankenstein's monster invokes immediate horror in people. And it's not that he's hideous in aspect in that he doesn't look misshapen or lumpy or have giant stitches. Not in the original Frankenstein.
Right.
What invokes the horror is what I would call the uncanny valley aspect, in that he's so close to being alive, but he's not.
Yeah.
And that is instantly perceived by everyone who meets him, and is immediately off-putting and creates a sense of body horror in them. So it would be easy to take the body horror track and make comparisons there. Do you think that that's valid? Or do you
absolutely.
think that provides any useful comparison?
Yeah. I think really you're right on there. And any time that we run into the uncanny valley in science fiction, there is a comparison to be made to Frankenstein. Whether it's or no matter what time it's coming from. I thought immediately as you were talking of movies like Gattaca or AI, which very much have that sort of like, whether it is one character, whether it's the whole movie, that, the same sort of plot concerns as Frankenstein, the same encountering the uncanny as Frankenstein, very much building on that maybe not quite body horror. Like the Human Centipede is definitely an outlier in terms of like obvious. I haven't either, and I will not watch that. Sorry, but I think it's a really good example of like what you don't have to do in order to invoke that kind of horrificness that you're saying. Because I mean, like that's and horrificness is even maybe too strong a word, but like just that kind of visceral unease that the uncanny valley provokes.
Yeah it would be very interesting, I think, to see a John Scalzi or someone who writes robotics works, like maybe Daniel H. Wilson, who wrote Robopocalypse, and have them write a modern Frankenstein. It would be very interesting to see what intersections a modern author known for their interest in the uncanny valley, like what angles they would take.
Right, and even like if we're thinking about that, I'm thinking of Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. Like thinking about the robot character whose name I forget right now, but who goes through this this full journey of discovery of gender, of sex, I'm fucking this up right now because I read Autonomous really quickly because I really liked it and I need to go back to it. But my point is that it's kind of almost like a self-Frankensteining. Like, Robot is, via other characters for sure, but like both Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster in one. And I think analyzing Autonomous from that angle would be really interesting. But
yeah, and you could even draw a direct line from Annalee Newitz and Autonomous to Martha Wells and the Murderbot Diaries series of novellas, which is brilliant, and you should definitely read if you haven't already. Oh, I'm so excited for the number 2 and number 3 coming out this year. Anyway, so these stories deal with the cobbling together of identity, like robots kind of generating their own identity, figuring out the gender thing, or not figuring out the gender thing in some cases. And in a sense, they both embrace and reject the Frankensteinian paradox of what makes a monster, what makes a human. Murderbot especially kind of embraces this idea that it's okay to not be human, it's okay to embrace those things which take you elsewhere, which essentially not just embrace the uncanny valley, but take the uncanny valley and run like straight up the hill past the border of the uncanny. And Annalee Newitz does some of the same things in Autonomous, and she does a lot of things in Autonomous, and I highly recommend you read that book as well. Because the Frankensteinian parallels are just like the smallest fragment of what she does. So it's not a perfect comparison, because I don't think she was they was going deliberately after, the Frankensteinian thing. But there's a whole subgenre of science fiction where you can find little hints of Mary Shelley.
Yeah, definitely. But
and what she was interested in.
At the same time, like, I think because her impact has been so large, because there's so many lineages that go back to her, like, you would be hard-pressed to find a work of science fiction that isn't similar to Frankenstein in some way, whether it's like, an out-and-out parable about the dangers of technology, or about, creations rebelling, or about people who are destroyed by their own creation. Like, there are little bits of the uncanny valley, of body horror, of tropes that, probably we don't even have names for anymore because they're just so prevalent that they've become so interwoven into what makes science fiction that we don't even remark upon them anymore. So it's and that's again, not to harp on this the entire time, but like thinking of Mary Shelley as and Frankenstein as the beginning of science fiction, it's everywhere. It has to be everywhere. Like its legacy has to be in every work of science fiction, whether or not it is implicit or explicit.
Right. And circling back to the gender thing, I do think that it is impossible to completely separate questions of Frankensteinian plotting, I guess, from the author's understanding of gender and how we create identity. I mean,
Yes.
those two things are so interwoven, how we create identity and how we create stories,
Yeah.
specifically in science fiction.
Yes.
And if we accept the idea that Frankenstein and Frankensteinian narratives are inherently concerned with gender,
Yeah.
then that opens up new doors and possibilities as well for analysis, for writing. I mean, it becomes a kind of science fictional shorthand. And that can be really useful, or it can be a hang-up. And I'm thinking of all of the science fictional works which conflate uncertainty about gender with horror, body horror and otherwise.
Yeah.
And like, we've made a lot of missteps in this genre to
Yeah.
do with Frankensteinian horror,
Yeah.
and specifically its ties to gender. But we've also made some really interesting moves too. So I'd be curious what you would think of, like, what is the future of the Frankensteinian narrative? Whether we're taking just a single trope and running with it, or taking like the inherent questions at the center of it, like gender and identity and how we become our creators, and or our creations become us. You know, like whether you're looking at one single thing or like the whole of it. What's the future for Mary Shelley and Frankenstein?
Well, here's the piece I would add to everything that we've said already to kind of like, you know, not close the door, but like, you know, finish this off on a strong note. And that is to echo what you're saying about identity. Like, both within the text and what was going on outside of it, identity is so central a concern, and something that was so absented from science fiction for such a long time, especially when it was being written by, you know, scientists and engineers who are all white straight men in the 40s, 50s. But this question of identity, both of, you know, Dr. Frankenstein as the creator, Frankenstein's monster as the created, what is the identity of this creature that was cobbled together that now has to make its way in the world, you know? And again, when I say, like, present in all pieces, like, that sort of identity question is the same thing that's, like, replicated in a very small way in, like, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when the sperm whale that pops into being has to come to terms with who it is and, like, what its identity is. Sorry.
Too soon.
Sorry.
That scene will always be too soon.
I know. It is haunting. But, like, you know, to the works that we think of that are concerned with identity as a primary focus. And then going all the way back to Mary Shelley, you know, knowing something about the context, which I just looked up, she wrote Frankenstein really quickly. She wrote it in part, like, while she was in Lord Byron's house during a thunderstorm one weekend or something. I'm getting the details wrong, but, like, you know, and just this notion of identity, of, like, who was Mary Shelley for that weekend? Like, who was she interacting with? What were the identities that she was thinking about explicitly or implicitly? Like, who was she as she was writing this book? Like, who was that 19-year-old who was putting this all together? And that's such an interesting question that has so many important bearings on everything that science fiction does today and can do in the future. And we can trace it back to, like, one rainy weekend in which Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And that is, like, so fascinating.
A whole genre was invented in a weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a ghost story, a modern ghost story. But it was also, I mean, 19-year-old Mary Shelley was badass.
Yeah.
I mean, 1818, she pulls that epigram from Milton. And the epigram frames the entire work of Frankenstein in the larger question of consent. How and in what ways, or do we ever, consent to be made? And what role does being made play in our formation of identity? I mean, for a 19-year-old to be so aware, consciously or unconsciously, of the role of consent in identity making, I was not that woke as a 19-year-old. I was also not, you know, I had not been a mother for 2 years when I was 19.
Right.
I mean, she'd gone through a lot of shit, not saying otherwise. But, I mean, that's a really interesting question to start an entire genre with.
Yeah.
Identity.
Yeah.
How we become who we become. And that's really, I think, profound and beautiful and crazy and awesome in all the best ways.
Yes.
So, I mean, kudos, Mary Shelley. If I had a time machine, I would not just kill Hitler, but I would go and meet Mary Shelley.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Maybe bring her to kill Hitler. I don't know. She'd probably be into it.
I would also play her Britney Spears Toxic, just because I feel like that would be a perfect
Oh my god. Yep. All right, and that's it. That's the end of the podcast. Microphone drop.
So, Tony, where can you find us?
You can find us deep within Britney Spears Toxic all the time. You can also find us on the internet at www.imaginaries.net and under the Imaginaries on YouTube, SoundCloud, and iTunes. And also on Twitter at imaginary_pod.
And Tony, what have we been doing lately on our website that we haven't been doing before?
Well, you should. You not only can, but you should go to our website and check out our written reviews. We have just been going through so much material that when we first started this podcast, basically both of us might read a novel and then we'd be like, hey, that was a pretty good novel. We want to talk about it. Or we'd watch a movie and we'd be like, hey, pretty good movie. Let's talk about it. Now, like, between podcasts, we each easily read like half a dozen books. And we're like, there's just so much that we like take in that we can't actually include all of it. Much as we'd like to, because there are a lot of good books out there. They're what inspired the Imaginary Awards. We wanted to give awards to everything that we really liked. So we've started to put up reviews on the website, so you can go and check out good books, especially good books. And I won't say that they're just going to be books, but that's what we're starting with for now. So if you need some recommendations, or maybe if you need to know if a book is something you should avoid, check out our reviews. They are going to be up with increasing frequency in the future.
Yeah. I think at some point I will also start a list of texts, which I would add my own trigger warnings to. But for the most part, our website, like our podcast, is dedicated to things that we love. Mm-hmm. So we're not interested in tearing down wonderful works of science fiction, which maybe have one or two things wrong with them that are important wrong things for us. Mm-hmm. We're really, really interested in just building up the great authors that are out there and discussing larger trends and movements and how they impact us as readers and writers and creators of science fiction. Mm-hmm. So please check out our website. Tony, you will also be adding some original content now that your comics
Yes,
are
I
done
will be.
with.
Yep.
So more to come there.
More to come, and I'm not going to spoil it. Just you guys wait. There's going to be more.
Just you wait, Henry Higgins. Okay. And so that brings us to the conclusion of this week's podcast on Mary Shelley. Mm-hmm. We would love to hear your thoughts. We know that there's a lot of great scholarship out there about Mary Shelley. And some of the opinions we may have expressed may be controversial. We'd love for you guys to call us on it, interact with us on it. You can find us on Twitter most hours of the day, maybe not the night, but most hours of the day. And we would just love to hear from you. This week, on the note of our Twitter account, I would like to make a quick shout out to some of those listeners who have responded to us and or our website material this week. So first off, major kudos to Charlotte Geeter, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who loved our last episode on the enclosed space of a spaceship. Don't worry, Charlotte, we are going to be following that one up with part 2 here in a week or so, in which we will be discussing space stations and then other enclosed spaces after that. We also got some very nice comments from Angus McIntyre, author of one of the novellas we reviewed, Woot Woot, The Warrior Within, highly recommend it, and from David Thomas Moore, who was the editor of one of the collections we reviewed on our website. So we highly recommend that you engage with us on Twitter. We promise we will give you a little bit of a shout out if you do. And please read our reviews, like and respond, follow up and engage with the authors themselves and the editors themselves. They're fantastic people. We couldn't be prouder to read and boost their work. So thank you so much for listening to our podcast this week. And look for our next one on space stations coming up here in, a week? 2 weeks?
Yes.